Good morning, friends, and welcome to Explorers Forum. Today is January 10th, and we are delighted to welcome Sue Linderman, who will lead us in a 6-week series, Racism in America, the History We Didn't Learn in School. This morning, instead of an opening prayer, I wanted to share a brief portion of a poem by John Greenleaf Whittier entitled The Meeting. The last 4 lines of this particular portion are on a banner that hangs in the meeting room at my school. And anytime we are in there for meeting for worship, these 4 lines always help me center down and be ready to hear the day's message. So I hope they may do the same for you this morning. And so I find it well to come for deeper rest to this still room. For here, the habit of the soul feels less outer world's control. The strength of mutual purpose pleads more earnestly our common needs. And from the silence, multiplied by these still forms on either side, the world that time and sense have known falls off and leaves us God alone. Thank you again for joining us this morning, friends. I would like to turn things over to Sue now. She's going to tell us a little bit about herself and what has motivated her to explore this very important and timely topic. So, Sue, welcome.
Thank you, Margaret Ann. I appreciate it. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share this time with you all as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. A little bit of background about me. I grew up in Wilmington, graduating from Mount Pleasant High School before I went on to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science at Mount Holyoke College. My 27-year career with the DuPont Company in Wilmington culminated in the spinoff of its medical X-ray business via a leveraged buyout that created Sterling Diagnostic Imaging, of which I was its first president. I'm especially proud of the long-term R&D investment by my business that developed a selenium array for image capture that is now at the heart of nearly every mammography machine in the United States. Just a side note. I am a co-founder of Westminster Presbyterian Church's Peace and Justice Work Group in Wilmington that was formed in the spring of 2018 with the twin goals of combating violence in Wilmington and promoting racial justice. Now, I grew up in a virtually all-white environment. Until I left for college, the only Black person I knew was our mailman, Mr. Brown. And then I found myself on a multiracial campus during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, 1963 to 1967. My experiences there launched a journey that continues to this day. I've had a lifelong interest in history and as a political science major in college, but I did not discover until 3 or 4 years ago that I was missing a significant portion of our country's history. In my experience, American history classes stopped with the Civil War, a little bit of Reconstruction and those darn carpetbaggers, and then it picked up again sometime after World War II. But it was the series of police shootings of unarmed Black men in recent years that galvanized my interest in learning more about those missing years or that missing history. Much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes that we hear or hold are a direct consequence of intentional economic and public policy and personal beliefs that have no grounding in biology. Other countries with similarly sordid racial pasts have sought to move forward by a process called truth and reconciliation. America is in desperate need of such a process. So we here for these 6 weeks will embark on a search for more truth. Much of it is painful, especially for those of us who profess to believe that every person is a child of God, that we are good people who seek justice and peace. I believe that in bringing to light this history of ours that we should have known, but didn't. We may be transformed in deeply meaningful ways with a new or renewed urgency to act, to finally and truly address the profound inequities that exist in our society today. So let's get started. Now, I have given this class multiple times in multiple venues over the last couple of years, but I've inserted a new slide today because I don't believe that we can leave unmentioned the events of this past week. And so I share some images with you, many of which I believe would be familiar. So while there are numerous factors that led to the horrific assault on our Capitol on Wednesday, there is a racial dimension to all of this that is unmistakable. Yet one more consequence of our country's history. So our purpose in these 6 weeks is to develop a better knowledge and understanding of our country's racial history, which is a legacy of racial inequality grounded in the enslavement of millions of Black people, followed by decades of terrorism and racial subordination through public policy and cultural attitudes. We're going to have 6 classes, and as I go through this material, I will be using a variety of terminology: African, slave, African American, Negro, Black, Black people, people of color. Sometimes these terms will come from direct quotes, but I'll seek to be faithful to the time period and the context of the information that's provided. So today we are going to focus on the early years, beginning in 1619 through the Civil War and into Reconstruction. Next, we will cover a period called slavery by another name. Brian Stevenson, whom you likely know or know of, has famously said that slavery in America didn't end, it evolved. And the period following Reconstruction into the 20th centuries was certainly a marked evolution of slavery. Our third week, we will look at public policy and the civil rights movement, then mass incarceration and the war on drugs, voter suppression then and now, and importantly, in our last class, where do we go from here? What do we do with what we've learned, with what we know? So we begin at a point on the coast of Virginia, Point Comfort. It's a hot day in August of 1619, and a ship appears on the horizon. It has come from Africa. It has had a very difficult journey, and the crew and the captain are in desperate need of reprovisioning and repair. And so the colonists in Virginia seek to help the captain and his crew and are reimbursed for their efforts by receiving 20+ kidnapped Africans who are part of the cargo on board. And so this marks the first point at which Africans come ashore into the colonies. Now, initially, their legal status was servant. In fact, the major crop in that area at the time was tobacco cultivation. That was a difficult crop. It's very hard on the soil. You cannot plant year after year tobacco crops because of the nutrients that it leaches from the land. And so that need for more land for tobacco cultivation, in fact, led to the westward expansion that occurred in the United States and the confiscation of more and more land from the Native Americans. And of course, it has been said that the United States was founded on the near genocide of one people and the enslavement of another. And so here we are at that start. Now, initially, the tobacco cultivation was done by workers who came from Western Europe. They were white, although not called white at the time. They were indentured servants. They were recruited to come to the colonies. They would work for 7 years, and at the end of that time, they would be free to work for their own benefit and be given some land. As Western Europeans, they were covered by English common law, which prevented really significant mistreatment. But these Africans that arrived had no such support. Excuse me. So we're beginning in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. And here is a slave ship that would become part of the transatlantic slave trade. During this period of time, from 1619 to 1808, 20 million Africans were taken from their homes. They were kidnapped. They were marched or driven to the coast. And during that transit from their homes to the coast, almost 50% of them died. And so the remaining 10.5 million Africans were transported on ships like these. And because of the conditions, more than 2 million of them died. They were branded with hot irons and they were restrained with shackles. Their living quarters were often a deck within the ship that had less than 5 feet of headroom. And throughout a large portion of the deck, which is the lower diagram that you see, sleeping shelves cut this amount of headroom in half. But that lack of standing headroom was the least of their problems. With 300 to 400 people packed in a tiny area with little ventilation and in some cases, not even enough space to place buckets for human waste, disease was prevalent. The average individual space was 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, and maybe 3 feet high. And this passage from Africa to North America was called the Middle Passage. It was named that because it was the second of 3 legs of a journey that began in Western Europe, landed in Africa, loaded on board the Africans who had been kidnapped, brought them to the New World where they were exchanged for products that were taken back to Europe. So this Middle Passage often took 21 to 90 days, depending on weather conditions. And these were the conditions that the Africans endured during that 21 to 90 days. So as they arrived, the institution of slavery was established in the period from 1641 to 1750. You might be surprised to know that the first colony to legalize slavery was Massachusetts in 1641, and Georgia was the last in 1750. And the laws that were passed declared that Africans were chattel. They were property. They were owned for life. In the North, most of these Africans were house servants or unpaid skilled labor because many of them had significant skills when they were taken from their communities in Africa. But they were relegated to a subhuman status even in the North. And this myth of racial inferiority developed as a way to reconcile the growing desire for a free country, the United States, with the inhuman treatment of the African slaves. And that racial inferiority myth persisted as a justification for the system. So it's not a question of which was the chicken and which was the egg. Slaves were not taught to read or write. They were not allowed to marry. They were encouraged to have children to create more slaves. But families were torn apart, as we will see a bit later on. So Between 1774 and 1804, all of the northern states abolished slavery. After all, the slaves in the North were not an essential part of the economy. The institution of slavery was less efficient in the North because it was not agriculturally based, and the social acceptance declined rapidly. And so in the midst of that period, the United States Constitution was written and ratified. And there was an issue in drafting the Constitution in terms of representation in the Congress, because that representation was based on population. So it was in the southern states' best interest that slaves be counted as part of the population, even though they had no rights. The North didn't want that to happen because it would diminish their impact in Congress. And so a compromise was worked out, and it is written into the Constitution that a slave counts as 3/5 of a person, not a whole person. Native Americans counted as 0. And in fact, in one of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, Native Americans are referred to as merciless Indian savages, the only reference made to them in our founding documents. Now, when the Constitution was written, there was a belief on the part of some that this institution of slavery would not continue indefinitely. There were some who believed it should come to an end. But the compromise, again, that was worked out was that the system of importing slaves from Africa could be ended by the US government, but not until at least 20 years had elapsed. And so, pretty much as soon as that 20 years elapsed in 1808, the United States outlawed the importing of slaves. But particularly in the South, the need for that slave labor was as great as it had ever been. In fact, it was even greater. And so the South needed a self-reproducing labor force. And so the domestic slave trade was introduced. And during the period of time that that was in effect, more than 1 million slaves were sold at auction. They were herded into pens where they were held until they were taken to the stage to be auctioned off. Families were split up. Half of all the slaves were separated from their spouses or their parents. By 1860, Montgomery, Alabama had more slave trading places than it did churches and hotels. And here is a representation of an advertisement for slave trade for sale. Mary Jane, about 11. Martha, about 10. Louisa, about 7. Priscilla, about 9. About because their birth dates weren't recorded. There were no birth certificates. And it is noted that they are all children of Judy. If you go to the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., there is an amazing section of display devoted to the slave trade, and it is compelling and heartbreaking. So the economic imperative in the South, they'd moved from tobacco to cotton because cotton was not so hard on the land. The problem with cotton, they had plenty of slaves to pick it, but the process of turning it into fiber involved pulling all those little pieces, parts away from the fiber itself. That was extraordinarily labor intensive and time consuming and limited the amount of cotton that the South was able to harvest and turn into fiber, until Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793, which mechanized that separation process, and the demand for cotton exploded. And the labor of the slaves became ever more essential to the economics of the South. By the mid-1800s, cotton was America's leading export. So the tension was beginning to rise between slaveholding states and non-slaveholding states. And in 1820, the Missouri Compromise was enacted. Missouri wished to join the United States, but they allowed the holding of slaves. And so the compromise was that a new state, Maine, would be carved out of Massachusetts, and Maine would be admitted as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. And that sort of held the situation at bay for a little while. But in 1854, the pressure continued for more slaveholding states to be admitted. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed that said the states could individually decide whether they wanted slavery or not. And if you have a little time and want to pursue the history of Kansas during this time period, it's fascinating. They actually had two separate parallel governments created, one that supported slavery and one that did not. But as a consequence of all of this and the growing opposition to the expansion of slavery, the Republican Party was formed in 1856. It was not formed because it was in opposition to slavery. It was formed in opposition to the expansion of slavery. And then in 1857, the Dred Scott decision was handed down by the Supreme Court. It is widely considered the worst decision that the court ever issued, although I would contend there have been a few here lately that might vie for that, that characterization. But basically it declared the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it said it deprived people of their property without due process, their property being their slaves. Further, it said that Blacks, slave or free, could never become citizens of the United States, and they had no federal rights. In writing the opinion, the Chief Justice Taney said, in the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. The Supreme Court. So by 1860, 80% of the GDP of the United States was tied to slavery. And so in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. There were actually 4 candidates for president that year. The Democrats had 3. And so the support from that party was splintered, and Lincoln got the most votes and became president. Within 3 months of his election, 7 southern states seceded. They were followed by 4 more, and then by Missouri and Kentucky. Now there's a myth that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, that the Civil War was about states' rights. And so the question is, which was it? And the answer is yes. It was both, but it was states' rights specifically to enable the states to sustain the institution of slavery. And if you read the various articles of secession written by the Confederate States, you will see that spelled out clearly. One example is the state of Mississippi. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product, which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the Black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, And a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has long been aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin. And importantly, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, gave what is known as the cornerstone speech on March 21st, 1861, just a few weeks before the Civil War began. He said, "This new Constitution, that is the Confederate Constitution, has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institutions, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. The general opinion of the men of that day, that is the revolutionary period when the Constitution was written, was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution of slavery would be evanescent and pass away. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition." And so the Civil War begins, and it is a terrible period in the country's history. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees 4 million slaves in the 10 southern states that are still in rebellion. It does not apply to the border states and the states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. But it deprives the Confederacy of much of its labor force. And ultimately, the South loses the Civil War. Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox in 1865. And by that time, there are 620,000 people dead and 1.5 million casualties in a population of 31 million. So at the end of the Civil War, we enter Reconstruction, which was really a pivotal period in American history, and it offered a ray of hope for a fairer, more integrated society. In 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery with an asterisk. And in our next class, we will spend a lot of time on that asterisk. It abolished slavery except in the case of conviction of a crime. Now, the 13th Amendment was passed by Congress in January of that year, before the Civil War even ended. And the 13th Amendment was ratified in December of that year, when enough states had ratified it. But all the states hadn't ratified it by the end of 1865. Delaware needed some time to think about it. So they didn't act on it right away. But, you know, with the dawn of a new century, 1901, seemed like a good time. And so Delaware ratified the 13th Amendment in 1901. Kentucky, they were not so quick to act. And in 1976, Kentucky ratified the 13th Amendment. And bringing up the rear, Mississippi, good old Mississippi. That state ratified the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in 2013. So there we are. Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts in 1867 that created the federal force that occupied the South. And next week, we are going to see a video from the Equal Justice Initiative that talks about the violence that occurred during this Reconstruction period, even while the South was occupied by federal troops. Congress passed the 14th Amendment in 1868, and that provided citizenship, counter to the Dred Scott decision, and applied due process to the former slaves. And in order for states to be readmitted to the Union, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. They had to call a constitutional convention in each state and ratify the 14th Amendment. And as you could imagine, that didn't happen really quickly in all of the southern states either. In its initial form, 10 of the 11 southern states rejected the 14th Amendment. And then in 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified that granted Black men the right to vote. The little ladies were going to have to wait a bit longer before that right accrued to them. But the 1872 elections were extraordinary. There was a great deal of violence trying to prevent Blacks from voting in 1872, but 90% of eligible Black men voted in the 1872 election. Blacks were elected to legislatures of the states. More than 600 state legislators were Black. 18 state executives were former slaves. The governor of Louisiana was Black, and that's the last time that would happen until 1960. There were 18 Black congressmen and 2 Black senators. And so it really was a moment of hope. These congresspeople, these legislators worked together on laws that improved the lives of everyone in the country. But the tide began to turn. The Ku Klux Klan had been founded in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. It was initially, its purpose was amusement, riding horses hooded through Black communities, qualified as amusement. But in 1872, Congress passed, whoops, going the wrong direction here. Congress passed the Amnesty Act, and it basically pardoned 150,000 Confederate troops. And it ended the disqualification of office holding by former Confederate leaders. Now, these former Confederate leaders, many of them thought that they would be arrested, perhaps executed for treason. After all, what else could you call what they had done? But the Amnesty Act said all is forgiven, and you can run for office again, and you can be in charge of the governments in the southern states if people elect you. And so the violence that preceded the 1876 election was horrendous in terms of focusing on preventing Black men from voting. And we will talk more about that in depth in a later class. But as a consequence of all of this, there was no winner of the 1876 election. And so a compromise was created whereby Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, who were the 2 candidates, Congress and the Supreme Court decided that Rutherford B. Hayes could become the president of the United States if he would promise to end Reconstruction. And so he did, and they did, and the federal oversight was removed. And that will lead us into the next phase of our country's history that we will focus on next week, slavery by another name, because once that federal oversight was removed, the consequences for the population, the Black population, were horrific in so many ways.
Thank you, Sue. I can say that I learned a few things that I had not known previously. which are surprising and horrifying at the same time. So I will open up to questions and comments and discussion. So if you have an idea that you might like to present, please use the raise hand feature and hopefully I can see you. Oh, got it. Larry.
I have a question for Sue. What is the difference between dead and casualties? I thought
casualties were injured. Yeah, so they would have suffered some form of significant injury in addition to those who had died. Yep.
I'm just curious. I'm not being a native of Delaware. I'm kind of ashamed to admit that I grew up in Virginia at this point, but not being a native of Delaware, I was not aware that it took Delaware so long to ratify the 13th Amendment. I don't know if that was a surprise for anyone else. So, John.
Sue, can you speak directly to the internal slave trade in terms of the connection to the cotton gin and what that meant for maybe Northern Blacks and particularly border state Blacks in Virginia and what that meant for them?
I'm not sure I fully understand your question, John. The invention of the cotton gin meant that the potential for cotton crops exploded because so much more cotton could be turned into fiber. And of course, the North, Virginia and the northern states were heavily involved in the commerce that came about as a result of the cotton trade. And there were many subsidiary and peripheral functions associated with commerce, with milling the cotton, with winding the cotton fiber, with shipping it to Europe. And so in essence, the whole economy of the United States became wrapped up in the cotton crop. So many Americans, regardless of where they lived, were involved in some aspect, direct or peripheral, with that fiber industry. And so it went well beyond the actual picking of the crop and the slave labor in the South. And that's why 80% of the US GDP was tied to cotton by 1860. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
We have several more coming up, so let's see if we can get to all of them. First, I see Patrick and Noble.
Thank you for that, Sue. I grew up in a segregated school system in Chester, Pennsylvania in the 50s and 60s. And during my formative years, elementary school and junior high school, I learned some of this, but the curricula were decided by the largest school district, which was controlled by white people. So the things that you have shared with us today were never a part of the curriculum. We had some wonderful Black teachers who shared some of this with us, but this was never part of the curriculum. I think that until we are educated as a people, then we cannot possibly begin to have reconciliation. It has to be truth and reconciliation. So my question to you is this, to your knowledge, has there been any evidence that what you have presented here today is being incorporated in the curriculum of our public schools?
No.
Good answer.
And there are a couple of issues. One is the pervasive influence that the state of Texas has on the content of textbooks across the country. You may have read the story here not too long ago where Texas was demanding that any references to Hillary Clinton having been Secretary of State must be removed from the textbooks that were being printed as one. So if that was an issue to die over, you can imagine what's happened to this history in the context of the textbook. So there's that. Secondarily, one of the things that I have done as a consequence of this, I have been in touch with the Red Clay School Board. because I believe that it is essential that if we can't have textbooks that contain this information, we could at least offer classes that contain this information. And so I contacted the board and offered to work with whomever to see about a way to create either a seminar series or a high school add-on to American history or whatever that would begin to provide some of this information. Because I live in the Red Clay District, so that's why I began here. And quite frankly, I was shunted off to other players not on the board, and have received no response to my offer to help provide this information. I'm not done, but that has been the initial, not lack of response, there's no response. You know, I provided some information, I gave some slides, I offered some background, said I would work with them in whatever way. And I would appreciate the opportunity to just discuss what the possibilities might be. And nothing.
It's very sad.
It is.
Yeah.
Actually, it's more than sad. It's just tragic. Because as I said at the beginning, and as you reaffirm, in order to get to reconciliation, you have to be basing it on the truth. And if you don't know the truth, where do you go?
Thank you for that. We have 2 more hands raised. I'm hoping we have time to get to both. The first is Sarah Ryan, and then we'll go to Brenda after that.
Sue, thank you so much for this presentation. I also learned some new things. I have a few sort of comments. As I was listening, I came up with some additional comments. My first thought was that I think it's just so interesting to hear about the connection between the economics and slavery. And I think about, it makes me think in the current time, how much of systemic racism is connected to people's beliefs about economic rights and choices about what's better for what people believe is better for the economy. And then just a few thoughts about other things. My son goes to Wilmington Friends, where he had an African-American teacher for American history. And while I don't know the particulars of that, he has said that it has been, he is really grateful for having had an African-American high school US history teacher, and that really made a huge difference, I think, in the history that he learned and how he learned it. And then the other thought is, I will, as soon as I can find it, if I can do it before we leave, I'll put it in the chat. There's a link to, I believe it's teachers at Cesar Rodney, who made a video. It's predominantly teachers of color, but not exclusively teachers of color, who made a video at the end of the summer, right before the school year started, sort of talking, I'll share it, their voices are much more powerful than mine, but speaking to their students, that their voices matter, that the events of the summer, you know, so propelled them to want to create a video for their students, telling them that their voices matter. So I think that within the school systems, there really are players who are working for change, and I trust that that we can all work to find them.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you. Brenda.
Just a note, school librarians have been working for a long time with the whole problem with the Texas having such control. I mean, a lot of the materials published there, distributed there, etc. And I'm sure there must be other textbooks. I don't know that. I've been removed from the library business for a while, but I know that school librarians in annual meetings and so on have been working on getting these changes. And when I think back to growing up in Minnesota, which has a very large Native American population, we had Minnesota history in 6th grade, and all we talked about were the white explorers. no mention was ever made of the massacre that happened in 1863 as a result of the Dakota Uprising. It was just as though it didn't happen, you know? Anyway, thank you.
extraordinary.
This was very informative.
Sarah has provided that link. It's Laura Sturgeon provided a link to this video in her most recent email to her constituents. And so I'm wondering if anyone else has anything to ask. And if I were actually following Robert's Rules of Order, I would say seeing none. And I'm aware that our pastor is on the call. I would ask if we could just, oh, hold on, I've got one more comment quickly. It says the text, and this is also from another former school librarian, the textbook issue in Texas is key to change, and school librarians are very involved, as Brenda said. So that is something to be aware of. And I'm also cognizant that we have some people who are involved in teaching history here and in working in our government. And so I'm sure this has been, as I said earlier, both informative and somewhat painful for all of us. And but as I heard recently, a quote is, if you're not feeling challenged, you're not growing. So I hope that we all can continue to be challenged and can continue to grow in our understanding and our compassion and in the work that we do to make things right in our world. So thank you all so very much for being here. And we all look forward to seeing you next week. Sue, thank you again. And we'll, same time, same place next week. Sue Getman will be our host for the following Sunday. So thank you.
Thank you all.